Desde eso viene toda su trayectoria y su carrera académica, ¿no? Tiene un doctorado de la Universidad de Stanford y fue por muchos años académica de la US Naval Academy, ¿no? Donde trabajó distintos temas de bueno, seguridad, derechos humanos, entre varios otros, ¿no? Y en ese contexto es autora del libro de The Rule of Law in Nascent Democracies, que bueno, se relaciona en parte al tema del que nos va a hablar hoy, tema tristemente contingente sobre la erosión de las instituciones democráticas en las Américas. Así que, bueno, le damos la palabra, que nos haga su presentación y luego vamos a abrir a preguntas, comentarios, un diálogo para terminar, obviamente, comiendo y tomando su juguito café afuera.
Gracias. Thank you so much. It's so wonderful to be here. Felipe, thank you for the invitation. Thank you for the introduction. I am, as you mentioned, most of my career was spent in academia, so it's really nice to be in a university setting. And it's really nice to see who's here today, because I'm hoping this can be more of a discussion than just me speaking to you, because a lot of the topics that I'm going to touch on are topics that you are all really deeply engaged in. So yes, the title of my remarks are well, no, it's not. It's addressing the erosion of democratic institutions in the Americas, because I think that there's been a lot of diagnosis of what's going on. So I'm going to spend a brief amount of time talking about the contours of the challenges. And so it won't be an exhaustive list of what the challenges are, but I'm going to focus on a few of what I think are the most pressing. And then I think the goal would be together we can talk about what we can do about this democratic decline. So I think we all know that we're in the midst of a global democratic recession, and a lot of the patterns that we're seeing in the region, I think we see in other parts of the globe, but there are some things that are very unique about Western Hemisphere. And I also want to say that I'm very deliberately using the term Western Hemisphere rather than Latin America and the Caribbean, because too often the United States is left out of this discussion of democratic decline. And at the dialogue, for example, we're going to make a much more deliberate effort to include the US in all discussions, comparative discussions of democracy in the Americas. You know, it was 4 days ago that we celebrated, that's definitely the wrong word, that we marked the 3-year anniversary of the insurrection, the coup attempt in the US. So, I mean, that was probably the most dramatic indicator of the problems we're facing, but there are others as well. So I'm happy to also talk about, of course, about the US. But it's a very diverse set of countries that are facing challenges to democracy. Bolsonaro's Brazil, Mexico is one that we're keeping a very close eye on. Northern Central America, Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, Bolivia, the list goes on. And they demonstrate, of course, that the challenges, and I know this is something you all know very well, but I think it's worth highlighting, is that the challenges to democracy today are very different than in the past, than before we began this third wave of democratization. So the source of any sort of reverse wave is no longer the abrupt constitutional or abrupt ending of a constitutional order, where there's kind of this very clear break. Instead, what we see is this gradual erosion of democratic rules, of democratic procedures, also of democratic norms. And so we see democratic leaders, elected leaders coming to power and then very deliberately dismantling agencies of horizontal accountability, checks on their power. And we're seeing this, it's also worth noting, on countries on the left and on the right, which is something what I'll talk about a little bit about US policy, is something that sometimes I think it gets obscured in the US analysis, because there's a tendency for us to see in the US for policymakers to look at the world as a left versus is right world, instead of these potentially more important variables. So it also, I think, illustrates that this is something that came up a little bit yesterday in the discussion about the newly launched militarization book that Marcos Robledo was a co-editor of, is this the fallacy of electoralism, that the belief that elections are enough for liberal democracy. So we have this would-be authoritarian playbook, and it's been really refined, I'd say, and perfected over the past 2 decades. It provides a very clear outline of potential actions that dominant executives can take, and leading to, of course, this ultra-presidentialism. And I think it's also been perfected because I see that it's kind of speeding up. In Bukele's El Salvador, for example, I think that the degradation of democracy has occurred at a much more rapid pace than in the past. So I'm just going to highlight 3 key actions that we're seeing and just sprinkle in some examples. And I'm sure you all have some indicators to add. But I think one of the big ones is eliminating judicial autonomy. A second one is going after freedom of expression. And the third one that I wasn't initially planning to talk, but after yesterday, I think it's an important one, and it's what's happening in Ecuador. And it's inviting the military in to play roles that traditionally or historically or we think should be reserved to civilians. So the first that I mentioned is undermining judicial independence. And this typically involves manipulating the institutional design of the judicial system so it can't fulfill its constitutional role as a check on executive power. And there are various ways that we see presidents doing this. One is to alter the appointment process to ensure that you get your loyalists, you get your cronies in there. We see this in many countries. We see this in Bolivia. We've seen it. I mean, Guatemala is a great example. And we saw the impact of that, of course, over the past 4 months with Arevalo. So the goal is, of course, to strip the courts of their autonomy, and that allows executives to do things like push through constitutional reforms to permit re-election. We see these kind of gymnastics happening in El Salvador today, so Bukele can run for a second term. And of course, then we were talking earlier about studying at Georgetown and some of the historical cases like Menem and Fujimori. But I do want to just draw out the Guatemalan case for a moment, because it's because of this subversion of the courts that the Attorney General and the courts in Guatemala have been behind what Arevalo, who himself has called a coup attempt, to prevent him from assuming the presidency on this Sunday. And I think it's really important too for us to keep watching Arevalo. I think a lot of people are going to breathe a big sigh of relief on Sunday when the inauguration happens. But the Attorney General is still there. These subservient courts are still there. And so the powers that be, the corrupt pact, they're not going to be done. I mean, they're going to continue to undermine Arevalo's ability to govern. Second is chipping away at freedom of expression. This is a civil liberty that allows critics of the government to express their opposition without fear. Across the region as a whole, attacking the free press has been a powerful tool for presidents who seek to concentrate power. And the new Latino barometer just came out, and I highly, if you haven't taken a look at it, I recommend it. It's very disconcerting. But so not surprising, perceptions of freedom of speech have declined in countries characterized by democratic backsliding. So according to the 2023 Latino Barometer, in El Salvador, 89% of government critics report that there is very little freedom of expression. So it's gone up 20, and it was already pretty low at about 70%. So it's gone up close to 20% in just since Bukele took over. In Bolivia, 85%. The number is 79% in Honduras, it's 77% in Guatemala, and it's 73% in Mexico. This has been definitely part of AMLO's strategy. And then the final one I wanted to touch on is this militarization in Modera that I mentioned at the beginning. And we had a chance to talk yesterday about this, but I want to just highlight again the case of Mexico, because I think it's very emblematic and it serves as a cautionary tale. And one of the lessons, of course, is that once a country starts down this path, it's really hard to reverse course. President Calderon, he was very, when he started this in December of 2006, he promised that it was going to be a short-term strategy, and he promised that there would be a very dramatic, quick decline in crime and violence. And it's 2023, what's math, 17 years later, and homicides, there's not been it hasn't worked. It's failed. It's been a failed policy. And the armed forces role in law enforcement has basically, it's complete. AMLO in his campaign promised to bring the army in particular back to the barracks, but now the armed forces, the army in particular, has replaced the police, and the military also has really roles in the economy. So they have a really vested interest in Modera. So they have a major stake in these very lucrative infrastructure projects. They have control over the operation of ports, of seaports, and customs. And related to militarization, of course, is the mano dura that we're seeing in El Salvador under Bukele, which has led to a human rights crisis. The Amnesty International last month documented something that we've been seeing, that concrete examples of the systematic use of torture on prisoners. I think it's approaching 75,000 Salvadorans are in prison. But on the other hand, there's been a reduction particularly in the homicide rate. And Bukele has really sky high relative to, he's really popular in El Salvador. And it's expected that he's going to win the election by at least, the surveys show, at least 70%, even though it's not constitutional to run for a second consecutive term. And so this is kind of, I think, where we can kind of switch to what can we do about this. And I think that this issue of security, we were talking right before, that security is one of the number one challenge, or and in countries across the region. And so what are we going to do about this? Because the Bukele model is catching on. I had an Uber driver who in Chile, who was saying, he actually used the term, we need mano dura in Chile. And of course, the temptation to turn to the military is great. So I think one of the things that we should be working on as a community is developing an alternative approach. Ecuador is key. Argentina, we talked a little bit about Argentina. What's happening about Argentina should be very alarming, concerning. So, that's one issue. And that brings me to this notion of developing an early warning signal. So, Jaime, we were talking about doing this in the context of citizen insecurity, but also when it comes to just democracy in general. What are some of the signs of, and I think you mentioned the idea of using like a red flag, yellow flag, but a warning system of sorts. And it's interesting because the OAS right now there's a subgroup within the OAS that's talking about how to revive or make the Inter-American Democratic Charter more relevant, more effective. And so one of the things that's being discussed on the side is, what about some sort of system like this? So I think that we could talk about what these indicators are and come up with some measurements. And keeping in mind that democracy is really a continuous, not a dichotomous variable. So, and then of course, pay very close attention to the different monitors, and then even break down. So if we're looking at judicial autonomy, for example, what are we seeing changes to the appointment and removal processes for judges? Something else we're seeing in the region are the executive branch using the press or using social media to attack individual judges. We see this with AMLO with his mañanera. Are we seeing that? Moves to reduce the judiciary's budget. There are various kind of sub-indicators we can look at. And I think it's also worth noting here that when we're thinking about this could also benefit the United States, any sort of early warning system. Something else I think that we all recognize, and it's a lot easier said than done, is to build legitimacy of democracy by focusing on governance, regime performance to demonstrate that democracy delivers. There's been a real failure of governance in the region, and there's a crisis of confidence in democracy, in a large part because citizens, they don't see that democracy is delivering their most basic needs, whether it be the ability to earn a livelihood, to send their kids to school so they can, assuming that they're going to get to school safely. So support for democracy began to decline about a decade ago. It hasn't recovered. In Latin America and the Caribbean, the support is about 59%. Only 41% of the region is satisfied with democracy. It's worse in the United States. Gallup just released a poll 5 days ago. It was a poll that they conducted in December about satisfaction with democracy in the US. And it's something that we've always kind of taken for granted as a given. But first of all, the support for democracy is much more shaky than many of us believed. But the level of satisfaction with democracy, with the way it's working, is 28% in the United States. People were pretty alarmed after the January 6th incident when it fell to 35%, but in the last 3 years, it's fallen even further. And so as long as, of course, citizens are unsatisfied with democracy, it's going to continue to lose legitimacy, and there's going to be a greater willingness to accept authoritarian alternatives. Something else, this is something that I'm really worried about the US right now. And to me, it's quite stunning, the level of support for a president who led an insurrection against on the US Capitol. And I think that those numbers are really reflected. When it comes to these numbers, the Gallup poll breaks it down also by party, and 17% of Republicans are satisfied with the way democracy is working. So I wanted to conclude with just a few words about US policy when it comes to supporting democracy in the region. And I think first, it's important to acknowledge up front that there has been a real lack of US engagement with the region. Especially in South America. There has been, attention to Central America, but that attention has been very limited to the migration lens. And it's consistent with the US history of looking at the region through domestic politics. So drugs, migration, Cuba. But I think there were a lot of expectations when President Biden came in that there would be more attention to the region. And of course, the world is not in a very precarious state. So there are a lot of other priorities, but I think it's still, I don't know, I think it's still disappointing, the level of the lack of engagement with the region. Something else I would mention about the US policy is that we've kind of taken on this very pragmatic, is what I think it's termed. Under Trump, we called it a transactional approach when it comes to our position towards democracy in the region. So on the one hand, you have the case of Guatemala with Arevalo, where the US was very outspoken in condemning the attempts to prevent him from assuming the presidency, concrete action, including the visa restrictions on over 300 Guatemalan functionaries, members of the private sector, and their families. But in contrast to that, the US is silent when it comes to Mexico. I think in large part because of the migration issue. So you see this kind of inconsistency. And it's something I alluded to at the beginning, and this has been a long-term problem. This is nothing new, is that many in the US government, especially in our Congress is so politicized right now, is that there's this real tendency. I think we were moving it away from it for a while, but we're moving back to it, to view the region through this left-right lens, rather than the distinction between liberal democracy and authoritarianism. And I think this is we're seeing a revival of the term pink tide in Congress. And I wish we would stop using that, because it really perpetuates this mistake of conflating the left with populism, when the reality is that assaults from democracy against democracy are coming from both sides of the political spectrum. And I think I'll stop here and open it up because I wanted to plant some seeds, see what you all are seeing, what you think, yeah, and exchange ideas. And I know I didn't touch on all of the challenges. I just touched on 3. So others that you want to discuss.
Español, sí. Bueno, tomemos entonces una primera ronda de 2 o 3 preguntas, Jaime.
First of all, thank you so much, Rebecca, for your friendship leadership and dialogue and all what you're sharing with us here. My main query is about the roots of how democracy as a system is showing an inability to deliver at least 2 main products of the social contract: security,
Yeah.
and somehow leveling the playing field for all citizens. So my query, I was wondering about how money in politics can be an explanatory independent variable in all the puzzle you're presenting us today, and how the pervasive nature in penetrating the state and the political system. I'm thinking about drug cartels, but also how state capacity as such, as a whole, is being penetrated by money in politics, by illegal and also legal money in politics, and how it can help us to look for solutions. It's very pervasive how money is working in terms of buying politicians, buying processes as such, and also affecting the lack of reforms in terms of social justice, but also in terms of making the market really working for the people and not against the people. So my query goes in that direction. So if I can have a reflection of what you think about it.
No, I think that's a great point. So the idea being that money is an independent variable that feeds into this. I think so. And I think that's actually a really important way to look at it. And I think there's variation across the hemisphere and how this plays out. I think in some countries, it's the legal route. I mean, in the US, for example, where despite years of trying to reform the system, money plays a tremendous role in politics, in campaigns, the lobbying system, the revolving door in Washington. Absolutely. And I just read a really excellent book called Empire of Pain about the role of the pharmaceutical money and impacting policy. And I mean, it's a really good example of what you're saying. The governance issue, it's interesting because I served in the Obama administration, and when we were trying as the interagency to think about what the causes are of the root causes of migration are in kind of Northern Central America, there was the security variable, the economic variable, and the third one was the governance variable. And we called it governance, but really it was about what you're talking about. And I think in Central America, and we're seeing this in Guatemala, it's a really Honduras with Juan Orlando Hernandez and the role of drug money. And yeah, exactly. So I would think that is, I hope that that's a topic that you're working on, because it has, yeah. Yeah.
They're buying states.
Yeah, they're buying states. They're infiltrating the militaries. Yeah. And I honestly don't know in the academic literature right now if that's something that's being pursued. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, thank you. My name is Vivi Jackaman. I work at the UN. Thank you, Rebecca, for being here. It's very, very interesting to hear you laying out some of the problems. And it's difficult to ask you a question because I would love to talk about 1,000 other things, right? The election in Mexico, Arevalo, you mentioned, the prospects of the government of Milei, you name it, right? But I do want to focus on, I was mentioning to you what I think is the single most important problem in the region that you, Jaime, just talked about, which is organized crime. I would say organized crime instead of security, right? Because it does have all of the implications in terms of capturing democratic institutions in so many levels. But I understand that dealing with the issue is not, there is no single bullet. I understand that it's multidimensional, extremely complex. However, I would like to ask you, what do you think about the idea that I know is not on the table of legalizing drugs? I know it's not on the table. I know it's something that is, you know, way off the discussions. However, that's a route that we have not explored as the Western Hemisphere. Some a little bit in the US, right, recently. I wonder to what extent that could contribute to easing a little bit of some parts of organized crime, right? Trafficking in persons, not gonna, but all of the connected crime that comes out of drugs. And so my question to you is, do you see any feasibility of starting that debate seriously? Talking about with numbers, with evidence, with, right. So yeah, so I think that that's one of the things that will be important to talk about. And let me just, another thing that you mentioned, it was very interesting to hear that you mentioned the Western Hemisphere, right? And you said because of the role of the US, but I wonder Canada.
Yeah.
Canada, we never talk about it. They seem to be in an island, very happy and very democratic. So my question to you is, you know, what's happening with Canada? I personally don't know. And how engaged or can it be? Is it willing to?
Yeah.
To engage in terms of, you know, going to the other direction, given that the US is not?
Yeah. So
Thank you.
those are, okay. So I will say upfront that I'm coming from my personal position on is that the war of drugs was a failure. And so that it, yeah. So I just like, that is my position on the US policy on drugs. So I should say that upfront. That it wasn't the right approach. So I'll say that upfront. And I'll also say a little bit about the way that the dialogue is right now in the US on drugs. It's very interesting. It has changed dramatically over the last 4 years with with fentanyl. So it's really interesting. It's really in the US, it's really all the discussion is it's cocaine is just not even, it's not really on the radar. So I would say that's really, I don't know what the that impact will have on the broader discussion of legalization, but it's become a real issue in US relations with Mexico. Because, you know, the US is, you know, Mexico, you're not doing enough to stop the flow of fentanyl. And it's also being tied, I would say, because this election year is going to be so focused on immigration. It is going to be, I mean, I think it might be the biggest issue when it comes, it's just, and the language is becoming, I mean, it's becoming so toxic, and the Democratic Party is completely split on this, which is a problem to, you know, when it comes to defeating Trump. But it's one of the things that we're hearing more and more there's a lot of misperceptions about migration. One of the big ones right now is that it's illegal migration that's the source of the fentanyl in the United States. And it's taken on, even though it's not true. because, fentanyl, it's like it's just a teeny amount is all that's needed. And so it's actually coming through ports of entry. So I would say that from the US right now, it's fentanyl, but I think that it's high time though, that we have a conversation about legalization. I'm not an expert on it, so I'm not going to claim to be, but I feel that there is, what we've been doing hasn't worked, I would say. And I don't know, I mean, this is the area where I'm not completely comfortable talking about like where you draw the line, on which drugs are legal. So I don't think I'm equipped to talk about that. But I think that I mean, Ecuador, the last 2 days, I think we should consider all options. So I'm not saying, yeah. And I think one other thing I'll say about drugs is when I was in the Pentagon, one of my principal goals was to de-narcotize our defense relationships with the region. Canada is interesting because I just had a conversation with a Canadian board member who has said, come on, dialogue does nothing with Canada. Canada is willing to, I think that Canada is willing to participate in very discrete areas and to play a very positive role. I think traditionally on Haiti, Canada can play a very constructive role. I think on issues of gender, Canada has, and I'm speaking here largely from the defense lens but on the women, peace and security agenda, Canada was always really, really active. But I mean, those of you who have worked in government with Canada, humanitarian assistance, disaster response conversations, Canada was always very, very engaged. But I think that you don't think so? Yeah, yeah. And a lot of people are disappointed right now with Canada when it comes to Haiti. So I will say that, but historically Canada's played a really important role. But it's something I will say as we think about going forward, I think that Canada Canada, one of the ways I think the US has a lot there's certain discrete issues like Indigenous peoples issues. Canada is amazing compared to the US. And that's one of the areas that we're exploring, working with them on. Because as you probably know, they're really honest about their past. And I feel like it's almost like this, yeah. So I think that there are areas like that the region can work, but they're kind of discrete areas. But any other ideas on Canada? Marcos, I know you worked with Canada. If you had any experience to share.
I think the point is that the Canadian, voy a hablar en español. Yo creo que los canadienses han tenido una política muy cambiante hacia la región y han pasado por etapas en las cuales han querido tener un mayor protagonismo y después se han arrepentido y después han intentado retomarlo y después se han arrepentido de nuevo. Entonces, en definitiva, no han tenido la voluntad política para ser un actor en la región. Y también la agenda de Canadá con la región ha sido una agenda más compleja de lo que podría haberse pensado originalmente, porque hay temas en los cuales hay muchas afinidades con los gobiernos democráticos, pero hay otros temas en los cuales hay diferencias importantes y en los cuales Canadá no dialoga bien con la región, como los temas medioambientales, etc.
Yeah.
Entonces es una agenda complicada y está como al final lejos, ¿no?
Yeah.
Efectivamente ha habido una contribución en materia de seguridad en la región, pero es poco el diálogo.
Yeah.
Es poco, es muy limitado.
For the US, one area where Canada's been helpful is on Cuba, especially when Obama pursued the opening, because Canada is has a historic presence in Cuba. And so that was one other I thought of. Like it was I mean, this was something that was very interesting with the Biden administration. I think a lot of us thought that at the very beginning, Biden was going to resume the Obama policy of opening to Cuba, but he didn't. And I think a lot of people were very disappointed in that. But I think it's too late.
Gonna take my role and then, no. Felipe, okay, so we have should we take two at a time, maybe?
Yeah, two at a
So
time,
that
great, yeah.
We have some more time and I'm gonna abuse my role and go with mine. So you talked a lot about security and, organized crime. We know that that's the biggest concern, violence. But we know from multiple cases, the literature on history, political science, that there tends to be less violence where there are these pacts, right? Between, it happened in Colombia, it happened in Mexico. One of the reasons that the violence, with Calderon increases because they destroyed all the networks that the PRI had established, right? And their corrupt networks, etc. We know that from many other cases, and that Bukele also has a pact with the gangs, right? So we can say that from an academic point of view, but that's very uncomfortable fact from a policy perspective, right? So no one wants to push for pacts with criminal organizations to decrease violence. There is a trade-off there. And we also know that people care a lot about corruption, right? So no one's gonna say, yes, we're gonna enter into these deals. So what do we do with that trade-off that, we know that, doing things like penetrating certain institutions and having certain arrangements facilitates or decreases violence, but, also it's something, from policy perspective, that's very complicated to address. Okay, Felipe, and then.
Gracias por tu presentación, Rebeca, súper interesante. Te quería preguntar, así como dijiste, que el tema migratorio complica la relación de Estados Unidos con México, lo inhibe para impulsar ciertas iniciativas porque tiene ese problema urgente que resolver. Te quería preguntar en ese mismo sentido, ¿cómo el factor de China en América Latina determina ciertas políticas de Estados Unidos hacia la región y cómo piensas tú que eso podría eventualmente cambiar dependiendo del tipo de administración que se tenga? Porque hay una gran división en términos de la posición hacia China que se tiene dependiendo si es Trump o no. Eso quería preguntarte.
So I'm going to take a stab at the first one, but I'm going to say up front, I'm not an expert on PACs, but I do. The case I'm most familiar with is El Salvador. And first of all, Bukele, I think, would deny the PAC. There's a lot of El Salvador is really interesting because there's a lot of kind of conflicting information kind of coming out, and a lot of that's provided by Bukele. So Sanchez Serén there was a pact with the gang and it fell apart. So there's a question, I think, about stability of pacts with gangs. And then I think that's one of the arguments, but if there's anyone here who knows this topic deeply, please chime in. And I think in the case of Mexico, one of the big concerns with the pact was exactly the money concern that once you start working with in the case of Mexico, the cartels, because it also happened under the Salinas administration, and it allowed the drugs to penetrate the cartels to penetrate policy into such a degree that it was, I think, in the long run, not a great idea. But I don't know if others. Those are like little. Those are more anecdotal though than. But it's, if you're someone who's living in El Salvador and you've for 2 decades, you've you're willing to, it's understandable. The China issue, I would say, is on the face of it, actually probably the main driver of the key Biden initiatives in the region. So if I think about what the Biden administration, well, I think I mentioned this, I think I mentioned this at one other point over the last couple of days, so I apologize if I'm repeating myself. But right now, China is, the US is so hawkish on China, the Democrats and the Republicans. And this is the one area, I think, where there is a lot of bipartisan agreement. And I think that over this coming election year, I think it's the language that's going to kind of heat up more and more and more. You would think that this would lead to greater engagement with the region, because there's a lot of, I mean, the reality is, right, that China is a major economic partner to the region. So you would think that that would lead to engagement, which I think we have yet to see. However, there at least has been, I don't think that these have met their promise, but the two of I think the Biden initiatives that have gotten the most attention, one is nearshoring, which is a direct response about fortifying supply chains and, so nearshoring. And then the other one is the America's Partnership for Economic Prosperity. And Boric was in Washington when they started to put meat on the bones. And I think in a lot of ways that is meant to be a response to China. I think if you look at what APEP is, there's not a lot. It's not, I'm not saying it won't. It has potential, but I think right now, if you were really to kind of pick it apart, there's not a lot of there. So the other, so there's nearshoring, APEP, and an area, there have been countries in the region that have been, saying that, asking for like a free trade agreement of some sort as a way to, and those, I think that there's some that say a free trade agreement with Ecuador, a free trade agreement with Uruguay would be a good way to counter China. But free trade is like off the table right now in the US. It is a dirty word for both parties. So I would say our response to China has been lackluster at best. I think at times it has been counterproductive. I think under Trump, it was threatening almost, like kind of the language of like kind of forcing to make a decision between the two. And often with certain countries, they're accompanied with kind of racist language and just derogatory language without providing an alternative, saying you have to choose. China's dangerous. China's, is going to, like, all the reason, but speaking from the reasons given for China's, for a Chinese threat were all kind of concerns of the US, not concerns of the region. So there's also like this, our communications has been awful. I think with Biden, there's definitely, it's a much more diplomatic conversation, but I think there's still the failure ultimately to provide an alternative to China.
Gracias, Rebeca. Voy a hacer una pregunta relacionada con la anterior, que es, Estados Unidos ha estado vinculado con Latinoamérica en forma a veces errática, otras veces más positiva, especialmente en lo que tiene que ver con su desarrollo democrático e institucional. Y tú mencionabas ahí que, claro, pareciera que el lenguaje siempre es lo que le conviene a Estados Unidos, entonces Latinoamérica también tiene una cierta distancia con respecto a qué es lo que puede aconsejar Estados Unidos para resolver esto, erosión democrática en la región, en Estados Unidos también. Y mi pregunta es que si pudiésemos soñar, porque las relaciones se construyen en el tiempo, ¿Cuál debiese ser esa relación positiva? ¿Cómo se podría construir? Porque cuando uno estudia las relaciones Latinoamérica, Estados Unidos son quebradas, son por administración. No hay una política de Estado respecto, o así se ve, que diga sí, siempre es así, este es el objetivo de Estados Unidos con Latinoamérica, está realmente preocupado de su institucionalidad democrática. Uno no podría decir eso a lo largo de la historia.
Gracias. Lo que yo quería preguntar es algo relacionado con lo que presentó Felipe sobre China. Si nosotros pensamos que nuestras democracias actualmente están siendo muy deficientes en la producción de bienestar social y de seguridad, una de las causas de las erosiones también creo yo es que no existen o existe otro modelo alternativo de democracia, en esta vez popular, que es el caso de China, que sí es eficaz para resolver esos dos problemas. Entonces pienso yo que muchos están pensando en que una revitalización de la democracia en un futuro muy cercano va a ser esta vez por el lado de lo que está proponiendo China y no del lado de las democracias liberales que hemos conocido tanto tiempo y que tal vez nunca hemos conocido en realidad en América Latina, porque son teorías, son ficciones, pero en la práctica la democracia sin esos dos componentes centrales, bienestar social y seguridad, no tiene mucho sentido para el resto de las personas. Y China sí puede ofrecer esas dos cosas, tal vez adaptada a América Latina y al resto del mundo también. ¿Cómo observas tú ese contramodelo de democracia y su probabilidad de penetrar en nuestra teoría política liberal democrática?
Whew, those are two tough questions. So on kind of US policy towards the region, I think that the Summit of the Americas was for me a real opportunity to think about this, like what would a coherent US strategy towards the region look like? And I think that, well, first of all, I think it's important to note that there's a lot of fragmentation in the region as a whole. There's a lot of, as far as the inter-American system and regional bodies and their ability to get things done. I think it's a very difficult movement. The context we're in adds this layer of challenge. If you just look at the OAS and kind of criticisms of its ability to get things done because of the really deep divisions in it. So I think that what needs to be done is a real kind of a deep look at where there are shared interests and focus on those. And I think, for example, I think the energy transition and climate is one that we could build a shared agenda around. I think that there is potential to work together on migration. There was the LA Declaration on migration, I think building on that. Although I think that's tricky because I do think that the US still tends to look at migration as an issue of the southern border rather than a hemisphere-wide phenomenon. Healthcare, I think, is another area that I think kind of coming together and developing an agenda on issues that are shared. I'm thinking of a small example of this from the sort of the defense realm and this has to do, this is a very narrow example, but I think for a long time, the US kind of forced the narcotics to be at the top of the agenda instead of really listening to what the concerns were. And I think that, there was this shift. I don't know how consistent it is because I'm not really in touch with what's happening at this current moment. But, things like illegal fishing, that's a concern of the region that intersects with US concerns. And so let's focus on that. That's a small example from the defense sphere, but finding these shared challenges that aren't going to, there'll still be friction on how to address them but really doubling down on those. And I think it's going to also require on the US side though, and I don't know necessarily how to do this because it's going to require a real shift in the way we view the region, and instead of just looking at challenges, thinking about opportunities in the region. But that's much easier said than done. But I'd welcome your suggestions on that too. As far as the alternative model of democracy, I think that's of concern for sure. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think that we have to, like the US, the community of democracies, of liberal democracies, has to recognize that China does have a lot to offer, especially when it comes to these two principal unfulfilled demands of societies. And so it's a reality, right? That China can play that role if no one else is going to, and that the region has alternatives to the United States. But that alternative is a model that I don't really know how to answer that, because is there a way to get the benefits of the relationship without adopting that model? I feel like the roots of democracy in Latin America are
Tienes a empresas que dominan nuestros datos y que pueden hacer comercio con eso, o puedes tener un Estado que pone esos datos al servicio de algo en común. Creo que ahí hay un punto sobre la libertad individual, sobre el mercado, sobre resolver problemas de seguridad, donde China tiene una alternativa concreta. Lo estamos viendo en cómo China propone modelos de seguridad y también puede vender esquemas de seguridad al resto del mundo. El tema de la administración de datos creo que es clave ahí, y veo por ahí una grieta por donde nuestra democracia, como una palanca que lo va a abrir. Porque el mercado, francamente, no resuelve ese problema que tenemos.
And do you see what's happening is that because I know a lot of that too is done at the subnational level, when China working with the provinces and states when it comes to the kind of provision of technology. I mean, I don't know what the answer is to that. I think it's a reality. And so I just want to make sure I understand the question. Is the question is that preventable, or is it? I just want to make sure I understand the question.
El problema que veo yo es que China tiene un modelo que es democrático para ellos, unas democracias populares. Cuando China se relaciona con Latinoamérica, también expone los beneficios del modelo que ellos tienen constantemente. Nosotros vemos acá en las exposiciones que hacen gente de las universidades o de la embajada, los beneficios del modelo chino, y que puede resolver ciertos problemas de nuestras democracias ineficaces, como digo, en bienestar, desarrollo económico, seguridad. Entonces, y uno de esos puntos es el tratamiento de datos personales. Y el tratamiento de los datos también tiene que ver con la protección de nuestras libertades. Entonces, finalmente, un modelo comunista puede que proteja, por parte del Estado, mucho mejor nuestras libertades en cuanto a los datos. Entonces, por ahí creo yo que nuestra democracia, nuestro modelo, tiene una deficiencia muy fuerte y que los chinos plantean una solución.
And well, I guess, and I think what I would say to that is that without having an alternative, it's a reality, right? And I know, for example, for the US, when it comes to offering alternative technology at a rate that that countries can afford, I think the only country where we're really engaging on that is in Costa Rica. And so I feel like it's just a reality. Because I think that they're the alternative. I don't know what the alternative would be. And the danger is, of course, is if there's a government that takes this data and uses it in ways, right, that would violate, civil liberties, which of course is possible. But I would say that there are a lot of people, the concern about use of data is a big topic of concern in the US. Like, I don't feel like my data is protected.
Ok, vamos a tener la última ronda de preguntas.
Gracias, muchas gracias, Reika. Súper interesante tu very interesting presentation what you told us. Yo me pregunto, sin embargo, que en general el diagnóstico respecto del origen del problema, por lo menos para mi gusto, a partir de lo que tú dices y en general lo que uno escucha, está bastante claro. ¿Cuál es el origen? Está la migración, está el uso del dinero en el contexto de la política, la globalización en general, el flujo de capitales entre países, el flujo de personas, en fin, todo eso ha potenciado un cierto desconfort con la convivencia. No hay ninguna duda que eso tiene que ver y se pueden agregar otros elementos al diagnóstico también. Por lo tanto, me queda bastante claro qué es lo que está pasando. There's a decline, the trust on democracy, and there are a number of reasons why this really occurs. I wonder though, if you were to say at least 3 proposals as to how to deal with that, in your view,
Yeah.
what are the solutions to? Because the diagnosis to me is pretty clear, but I'm not sure what the solution is,
Mhm.
right? This is my question.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Sí, muchas gracias. En relación a, yo quería hacer 2 pequeños comentarios en relación con tu muy interesante exposición. El primero es que si bien hay una erosión de instituciones democráticas en general en la región, y uno de los problemas centrales es la seguridad, no todo es uniforme. La situación de seguridad está muy mejorada en Colombia en relación a lo que fue
Mhm.
hace 10 o 15 o 20 años atrás. También creo que es mejor en Brasil y no hay que olvidarse a la vez que una de las razones por las cuales se va a producir un cambio constitucional democrático en Guatemala es porque buena parte de la ciudadanía, los grupos indígenas salieron a protestar a la calle. Entonces, no todo es negro, ¿no?
Yeah.
Y así como todo no es negro, también es cierto que toda la percepción sobre seguridad, decadencia, etcétera, tiene caracteres muy políticos y muy subjetivos. O sea, la política tiene que ver con el hecho de que la seguridad se vea solucionada a través de la mano dura y no de otras alternativas. ¿Has pensado tú que el diálogo puede ser una plataforma para discutir la política de seguridad? Esto es, ¿cuáles son los factores políticos que obligan a determinados gobiernos a tomar la opción militar, por ejemplo? Es fácil decir la mano dura, pero la mano dura se comienza a percibir como una solución debido a factores políticos propiamente tales. ¿O por qué entran los militares en México? También hay incentivos políticos que llevan a esas alternativas. Mi pregunta es si no crees que ese examen, que no existe de manera comparada, no sería muy esclarecedor para pensar en alternativa
Yeah.
a futuro.
Yeah, so I think that's so one of the so we talked about a bit about this yesterday, because I think one of the contributions of the book that we discussed yesterday is that is what you're getting at, is that it's the militarization we're seeing today is qualitatively different than in the past. And it's not, this term remilitarization is actually misleading, because in contrast to the past, it's an invitation from civilian governments. And so I actually think that that's like the region, as you say, it's not monolithic. The threats to security are not monolithic. So, I mean, I think that would be a very worthwhile endeavor, and that might be something as we're thinking about how to address this and how to come up with alternatives are those factors that lead to that decision in the first place. So that's something when we have our first call, our first Zoom, I think we should explore. The question of what are 3 things we can do to curb democratic backsliding? Well, first of all, I'll say that our rule of law program has a whole, they have one of their lines of effort is how to curb democratic backsliding. And I would say that up till now, our answers are not sufficient. But I would say that there are, like offhand, I'll name 3. I have 3 ideas that I can throw out there. I think one is, you mentioned, well, I'm actually taking on this idea of that you mentioned civil society. In the case of Guatemala, there's a shrinking civic space in much of the region. But I think what Guatemala showed is that in the case of Guatemala, the indigenous movements were key actors behind Arévalo's ability to kind of counter this attempt to prevent him from assuming the presidency. So I think doing what we can to counter the shrink, but how do we counter it? That's the question. But providing more support to civil society organizations across the region I think civil society continues to play a critical role. I do think that this idea of an early warning system be a second one that I think could be useful. The third is subnational, one of the things that I think we're seeing is that federal governments, national governments, I should say, are increasingly dysfunctional, polarized, and unable to address the citizens' most pressing challenges. But we're seeing in certain states, in certain cities, that subnational leaders are actually coming up with solutions. So I think I guess my third idea would be let's pay more attention to the subnational level, work more with mayors and governors as they seek to address everything from the influx of migrants to transparency in government spending. There's some really interesting things happening at subnational level, combating gender-based violence, to climate adaptation. I think that looking more at cities, bringing mayors together. There was the City Mayors Summit of the Americas in I think it was in March or April of last year, and just it was so much more encouraging than the Summit of the Americas because you had these leaders who are so close to the constituents. They're not they're easy, they're more nimble, they're quicker, they're not as tied down by partisan and ideological debates. You had mayors of different from different ends of the ideological spectrum coming together and continuing their conversations after the summit. So I guess my third would be let's look more at the subnational level.
Bueno, con eso vamos a dar por terminada esta actividad. Muchísimas gracias, Rebeca, por
Thank you.
por darnos tu visión de estos temas tan apremiantes para la región. Y bueno, afuera verán que tenemos un cafecito, así que ahí seguimos hablando.
Gracias. The packed question is a good one. Because I only know 2 examples. I only know 2.